Well, it is back to school time again for many of our kids. The ones here in Lee County have been back in for 3 weeks, and those who throughout the rest of the country, maybe some of your grandchildren or great-grandchildren will probably soon be joining them after Labor Day. So it's a time for the usual preparations and decisions that need to be made at the start of the year. You have to get all the supplies on the new school list. You have to find the new classrooms, meet your new teachers, and of course, there is the dreaded where to sit for lunch question. My best friends in high school and I initially met because we were the kids who didn't have any other table to sit at during our lunch period. Now, I don't recall if we were actually ever told that we couldn't sit at another table. By that point in our school process, it was probably more subtle than that. There were books and bags probably holding spots for people who hadn't appeared yet. Or there were those discouraging looks as we approached with our trays. Or maybe it was just the fact that by the time we had been in school for 9 years, we knew our place in the structure of the school social life. After all, it only takes one snap of, "You can't sit there," along with the accompanying snickers of the classmates to learn where your proper place is. It's mortifying to be asked, no, to be told in front of a room full of your classmates to move. And it's still true. Most of our kids who are up here today probably haven't experienced it as much as they're just moving into the middle school years. But apparently it still happens in middle school and especially high school. Perhaps you've seen the current mobile phone commercial where the experienced older sister navigates her little freshman brother through the first day of high school. She tells him to pick his cafeteria seat carefully because, to quote, "Where you sit can define your whole year." And she's right. It can determine who will be friends with you that year, who you might date if you're old enough, and who gets picked for positions of honor such as co-captain of the football team or debate team. It might even have an academic impact on you. If because no one dares picks you as their lab or their project partner, and you're stuck with the kid who won't do any of the work. Now, thankfully, most of us here have moved beyond that strident social stratification of middle and high school. Or maybe it hasn't been so much left behind, but buried somewhere in the recesses of our minds, whether it was around cafeteria or playground status. And if that is the case, I apologize for bringing back those memories. But the social code of the school cafeteria provides a wonderful microcosm of the social codes of Jesus' day. For Jesus lives in a society of very defined and rigid social status, linked closely to the bestowing of honor and shame. This was especially evident at communal meals. One's mealmates not only indicated your status in society, but could radically affect it. Be seen eating with the wrong crowd, and your business prospects could dry up. Even where one actually sat at a table had wider ramifications than just indicating your relationship to the host of the meal. Your importance and clout in the community could increase merely by being asked to move closer to the head of the table. But be asked to vacate your seat and move down? That wasn't just an embarrassment for that evening. It could mean the loss of customers, your position of leadership in the community, and even marriage prospects. So Jesus' advice on how to deal with these social standards by sitting first in a lower place so that one may be asked to move up instead of down seems easy to apply to a Sunday school lesson. And the rest of the passage dovetails nicely with this advice we might give our young people as they head off to school. Invite those kids to sit with you at lunch that the other kids avoid. And Jesus' words seem ready-made for the high school context. Save that seat next to you on the bus for that boy who is bullied. Invite that girl over who the other girls avoid and tease because she wears second-hand clothes. And then the verses from Hebrews also integrate nicely. Constantly show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some have entertained angels without knowing it. Do all of this without worrying about whether or not it can be reciprocated or paid back. In fact, Jesus encourages us to seek out those we know can't reciprocate and make sure we include them. And these are all good sentiments, good practices. They are good for our kids to practice at school and for us to apply in our daily lives. After all, it is nice to invite someone who can't reciprocate, who otherwise would be left out if we didn't. It is more loving to look for those who are less fortunate than us and include them also. But I also believe that what Jesus is advocating goes beyond merely being more generous hosts. I believe it gets to the heart of how we view and how we treat each other as human beings and what we see as our call to living out our lives on our faith journeys. In the movie, Lee Daniels' The Butler depicts the fictional White House butler, Cecil Gaines, as he serves 8 presidents. One of the later scenes in the movie depicts the African-American Cecil and his wife, Gloria, attending a state dinner as honored guests of the president and the first lady. At first, Cecile and Gloria are thrilled to be there. But as the dinner progresses, they visibly become more uncomfortable as they look between their table mates and Cecile's fellow servers who are now serving them. In spite of the good-hearted and generous intentions by the president and the first lady, the Gaines seat at the dinner ends up highlighting the stark upper-lower, insider-outsider distinctions between the mostly African-American service staff and the mostly white guests. This fictional scene dramatizes the point that I believe Jesus is trying to get across in his words here. Now, no guest in this movie is anything but welcoming to the Gaines. Yet despite this, the Gaines still begin to feel as if they really don't belong there. They are still outsiders because of their race and economic status. They won't become part of this group when this is all over. They're there merely as guests. Welcome guests, invited guests to be sure, but ones who will go back to where they normally are when this dinner is over, outside the circles of power, prestige, and economic abundance that they are now currently dining within. Not because the people who was attending these dinners were evil or had bad intentions, but because despite the good and loving intentions of inviting them in the first place, the social structure they all lived in remains the same. Some are in positions of honor, and some are not. And even though that night Cecile and Gloria were welcome to move up to a higher seat, so to speak, the unspoken and most likely never even thought of assumption was that they or someone else would return to that lower seat. Because, well, that's just the way it works in our world. It's the way it always has. Not just at state dinners, but among us as human beings. No matter what criteria we use to determine status, whether it be race or age, gender, seniority, economic status, or some new criteria that we haven't thought of yet, there always must be someone in a lower position in order for someone to be seated in a position of power and honor. And since this is human nature, and given Luke's continuing depiction of Jesus sharing meals with both Pharisees and tax collectors, taking time to eat with both those considered saints and sinners, I believe there's a more radical call in his words than just to invite the help to come and join us for a meal for the change, or to reverse roles with the waitress next time she comes asking you what you would like to order. Jesus uses table fellowship and banquets as both indications and descriptions of what the experience of God's love is like and what it means for God's will to be lived on earth as it is already in heaven. So I hear a much more challenging call to action than to make sure that you sit at times with the kids others shun. What I hear is of deeper importance than just welcoming others who are different. Underlying his words is the call to abandon the ways that we use to judge whether we or someone else is better or worse than us, if someone deserves our love, attention, or care. It's to abandon not only when we look at others and place them lower than ourselves, but also abandon those times when we place others above us and put ourselves in those low seats. It's one thing to look around, try to find others who are less fortunate, or to whom we want to show our appreciation, and invite them to join us for a meal. And that's still a good thing to do. But it's another to naturally share those meals with them because, well, that's just the way it is. It's one thing to decide to go sit at the table with the kids who others shun because you know it's the right and loving thing to do. But it's significantly more difficult, if not impossible, to be equally comfortable sitting at the outcast table and with the cool kids, because you've never even made a distinction between the two in the first place. Yet that is what we continually see Jesus doing throughout the gospel. He is comfortable in both groups, not because he sees himself lowering or raising himself to belong in one or the other, but because he never makes that distinction in the first place. He applies God's radical grace and mercy to the norms and to the social structures of his time and eradicates them. And he then invites us on the path of doing the same in our lives and to see what happens in the world around us when we do. Jesus urges us to allow God's love to so transform us that we can look at anyone and see ourselves and them of equal worth, no matter what. Jesus invites us to allow God's mercy to radically transform how we live in our societal arrangements, so that our relationships with others aren't based on a matter of deserving or undeserving, above or below, whether we put ourselves or others in any of those categories, but that our relationships are based on the fact that God loves us all without condition and without reservation. Jesus invites us to view each other as God already views us all, beloved. So with my apologies to the writer of the letter to the Hebrews, I want to paraphrase and change one of those verses. I pray that we may all learn how not only to show hospitality, but true mutual love to all, recognizing that in doing so, we are always entertaining angels among us. Amen. You may have noticed that our hymns today were all communion hymns, talking about gathering at the table, and we did not have communion. Communion is one time that we are called to gather at the table, but each and every Sunday, we are called to gather at the table of God's love, at that banquet that Jesus shares of compassion and mercy and welcome. And then to take that and to go out and share. Much easier for me to say it here than to do it out there. You may have noticed that even when you sit at a round table, you always know who's at the head, or at least 99% of the time, even though there is no head of the table. And sometimes that's functional. We need to have a functional hierarchy. I was on the fire department, and trust me, I did not want to sit there with my other firefighters and debate what we were going to do before going into a fire. We needed the chief to be the head. The problem becomes when we take that function and start assigning worth to it, status to it. Better than, worse than, higher, lower, inside, outside. So I hope that as we leave here today, that we get another chance to sit at that round table of God's love. And even when we need, at times, the functional hierarchy, we can embrace the love of God for each other that allows us to see not only each other as the same, but also embrace that child of God within each of us that is just as good, just as loved as everyone else sitting at that table. May God bless you and be with you until I see you again.